What if the algorithm isn't actually keeping you from discovering new knitwear designers? What if you've simply reached your saturation point with what you're seeing and started interpreting that feeling as if it were evidence that there's something wrong with the knitting ecosystem? Because I think that people can mistake their own saturation point for an objective problem with the environment. Simply saying I'm tired of petite knit turns into petite knit is everywhere. I keep seeing Andrea Mowry becomes every knitting podcaster is talking about Andrea Mowry. The things being put in front of me aren't what I want to see becomes the algorithm is only showing us the same handful of designers. And this has been on my mind lately because I keep seeing different iterations and versions of this complaint in lots of different knitting spaces. And recently, someone commenting on one of my videos suggested another video to me and asked what I thought about it. The video was about, and I'm using the word that was selected by the content creator, blacklisting popular designers from your Ravelry searches. Not because those designers had done anything wrong, but because the creator was tired of seeing them and wanted other designers to surface instead. And I watched it. And I actually think there's an interesting argument there. Algorithms can absolutely amplify what is already popular. Trends can feed themselves. And if you're tired of seeing a particular designer, I think that using Ravelry's hide feature to change your own search results is completely reasonable. But the larger argument surrounding all of this got me thinking, because shortly after that, I received another comment on my most recent video, and I think it gives us a perfect example of this phenomenon that I'm interested in. The commenter said this: "Not liking petite knit is not the issue here. She's kind of omnipresent in so many vlogs, pattern ratings, that you get the impression there is no other good designer out there. I encounter this designer frequently, became the knitting media behaves as if no other designer exists. There's something called the frequency illusion, and selective attention is part of it. You decide you want to buy a red car, and suddenly you see red cars everywhere. There aren't suddenly more red cars on the road. You're noticing the red cars. And once something becomes salient to you, particularly if it annoys you, your brain becomes extraordinarily good at noticing it. You can watch a 45-minute knitting podcast in where the creator discusses a petite knit sweater, a self-drafted knit hat knit from the top down, a vintage cardigan, a Jessie made design, socks from a 1980s book, and a shawl they've had sitting in their Ravelry queue since 2017. And if you're already irritated by petite knit, you're thinking, God, everyone is knitting petite knit. Meanwhile, the other 5 things that were discussed barely register. That's why I'm cautious about accepting the assertion that knitting podcasts really are overwhelmingly talking about these designers without data. They might actually be, but there's also something else, and this is a big one missing from this conversation. A sweater isn't a lipstick. A beauty influencer can review 15 lipsticks in a month. A booktuber can conceivably read 10 books. A fashion creator can try on 20 dresses in an afternoon. A knitting creator might spend 6 weeks or more on one sweater. So if I know that petite knit consistently gives me clear instructions, predictable construction, an aesthetic I wear, and techniques I enjoy, choosing another petite knit pattern isn't necessarily evidence that I've been captured by an algorithm. It may simply be risk management. I've got $150 worth of yarn and 40 hours of my life on the table. Maybe I don't particularly feel like rolling the dice. And repeat experience compounds that trust. After I've successfully knitted 3 patterns by that designer, the 4th purchase becomes easier. That's basic consumer behavior. It's why people buy the same brand of running shoes repeatedly. It's why your grandmother bought the same brand of mayonnaise for 47 years. Sometimes Hellmann's just hasn't screwed you yet. Someone can truly say, I am sick to death of seeing petite knit. That's completely legitimate. But from that, it does not logically follow petite knit is being shown too much. Okay, now going back to that comment that was left on my recent video, it ended with this. Could there be a possibility that people would like to see the work of other designers too? Well, sure. But there's a hidden responsibility placed on knitting podcasters in that question that I also think is interesting. Because whose knitting is the podcast about? If I'm watching someone's personal knitting podcast, presumably I'm watching to see what it is that they want to knit. and what it is that they do knit. The creator doesn't owe me a representative survey of the independent knitwear design industry. That's almost turning personal creative practice into programming quotas. That's absurd. And it gets particularly strange because supposedly authenticity is one of the things that audiences value most. I'm an independent creator. I'm not an acquisitions director of a knitting magazine. I'm showing you what I'm knitting. I'd much rather encounter someone's work organically and think, holy shit, you need to see what this person is doing. It's incredible. And then tell you about them because the work genuinely grabbed me. Because then when I recommend somebody to you or something to you, you know that I mean it. My channel, my platform, and a lot of podcasters out there, it's a mixed bag of what they want to share. But for the most part, at least the ones that I do tend to listen to, it all comes from very authentically driven choice. And I also think there's something else happening here that's really important to acknowledge. There's a consumer side responsibility that keeps getting outsourced. If I want to discover obscure designers, I have to go discover obscure designers. That's part of having taste. Go 12 pages deep into Ravelry. Change hot right now to recently added. Browse projects. Create a Ravelry roulette video from time to time. Look at magazines. Follow designers with 2,000 followers. Follow designers with 100 followers. Ask knitters whose taste you admire. The internet has made an absolutely staggering number of knitting patterns available to us. And this is where I want to acknowledge another part of the representation question. Not every designer begins with the same access to an audience. And there are legitimate conversations to be had about whose work gets amplified in this industry. That's a worthwhile conversation. But I don't think that the answer to that question is simply to decide that somebody else has become too successful. Amplification does not require subtracting someone out of the equation. I want this designer to receive more attention, and that designer deserves less attention are two completely different ideas. And I think sometimes we collapse them into one. If seeking out designers who haven't received very much attention is important to me, I have an enormous amount of power to do that. I can seek them out. I can buy their patterns. I can knit them. I can talk about them. I can recommend them. And there's also an argument underneath some of this that attention is sort of or essentially a fixed pie. If one designer is receiving an enormous amount of it, then they are presumably taking that attention away from a lesser known designer. But I'm not sure we can assume that. If Petite Knit disappeared from my Ravelry search tomorrow, that doesn't mean that the next pattern I'm shown will belong to a tiny independent designer who's historically struggled for exposure or an audience. It might just be the 26th most popular designer on Ravelry. And if Andrea Mowry patterns disappeared tomorrow, I don't think that we can assume that every dollar currently spent on her patterns would redistribute itself among hundreds of other smaller designers. Some people might simply buy fewer patterns because sometimes people aren't looking for a sweater pattern. They're looking for that Andrea Mowry's sweater pattern. So unequal access to visibility and whether an already popular designer deserves their success are two totally different questions. I'm not going to tell you that knitting has perfectly equal access to visibility. I don't know that. I have feelings about that. I have opinions about that, but I don't know that. But I'm also not going to assume that diminishing one person's visibility automatically increases somebody else's. Because ultimately, if there are designers who I believe that have work or a body of work that deserves more attention, I don't have to wait for a Petite Knit to disappear before I give it to them. I can just give it to them. And there's this larger cultural habit kind of lurking here as well. People seem to want the algorithm to expose them to things outside of the algorithm. That's a contradiction. It's worth thinking about. We've become incredibly accustomed to having culture curated for us. Streaming services recommend what we should watch next. Spotify keeps playing when the album ends. YouTube serves up another video. Ravelry has Hot Right Now. And all of that is incredibly convenient. But I wonder if we've gotten so accustomed to automatic curation that we've forgotten that curation is actually something that we can do for ourselves. There was a time when finding things you liked required considerably more participation. You browsed, you flipped through magazines, you wandered around bookstores and record stores.
Do you have the new Depeche Mode record?
Yeah, it's over there, but it sucks.
You asked people for recommendations. You gave people recommendations. You made playlists, mixtapes, which requires an enormous amount of work. You followed one interesting thing until it led you to another interesting thing. You went looking. And the internet has made that kind of searching easier than it has ever been. Just think of the music industry alone. Think of what it meant to discover new artists back in 2002 compared to what it is to discover new musical artists now. Because now there's a feed. And I think sometimes we confuse confuse the feed with the available world. If my feed keeps showing me petite knit, that doesn't mean that the knitting world contains too much petite knit. It means that that particular window I'm looking through contains a lot of petite knit. There's multiple windows. You can look out a different window. Think about how strange this would be in the physical world. If you walked into a restaurant and you looked at the menu and thought, I don't like anything that's being served here, you wouldn't conclude that there aren't enough restaurants. You'd leave. You'd get in your car, you'd go 3 blocks down the road and find something you actually wanted to eat. In the physical world, we're accustomed to choosing with our feet. Online, I think we've become quite accustomed to waiting for the world to rearrange itself in front of us. And when what appears in front of us isn't what we want, it's very easy to assume that there's something wrong with what's being presented. We have to start reclaiming a little bit of that responsibility for our own taste. An algorithm can recommend things to me, but it cannot be responsible for developing my curiosity, for making sure that I encounter everything I might find interesting. And it certainly cannot know that I'm sick to death of something while I continue watching videos about it, clicking on posts about it, reading comments about it, and otherwise signaling that I find the subject incredibly engaging. At some point, I have to participate. If I want something different, I have to go looking for something different. And I think that's amazing and wonderful and awesome. And human will and free will and choice is such an incredibly powerful thing in all aspects. Choice is a human treasure, a privilege in a lot of ways. Use it.
Choice, I choose my choice.
Because it means we're not actually trapped by the algorithm. We have agency. The feed is not the world. It's just the front door we happen to walk in through. And I want this to bring me back to the term blacklisting. Using Ravelry's hide feature to do a lot of the things we're discussing here is utterly benign. I've seen enough Andrea Mowry show me something else. Fine. Useful feature, use it. After watching that video, what feels different to me is framing that personal filtering choice as blacklisting popular designers and how you can do it too. Because now we're moving beyond, I would personally like different search results, and to something more like, these people have received enough attention, let's deliberately redirect attention away from them. And I can't help but asking why? Why has success become something that requires correction? If a designer is successful because she manipulates customers, plagiarizes other people's patterns, produces bad patterns, or behaves unethically, fine, criticize the hell out of that. But their patterns are everywhere because people keep knitting them, buying them, talking about them, and recommending them. That's not misconduct. That's success. There's another criticism that deserves to be treated seriously, and it often comes up around some of these more popular designers. Some might say, petite knits patterns don't help me envision the designs on my body. That's useful criticism, and someone might quite reasonably decide that another knitwear designer serves them better. That's how markets work. But again, that's different from, therefore this designer's prominence is illegitimate. We keep moving from this product doesn't serve me to there is something wrong with this product being popular. Those are radically different propositions. And this doesn't serve me is actually enough. It's enough of a reason. You don't have to then establish that something is systemically overrepresented in order to decide you don't want it. You can just not like the sweater, because it's not just about petite knit. It isn't Andrea Mowry. It isn't Stephen West. It's our relationship and comfort with these people being very popular. We seem perfectly comfortable championing a small independent designer. Why doesn't anybody know about them? Then they get bigger. I'm so happy they're finally getting the attention they deserve. Bigger still. They're everywhere. And eventually, I'm sick of them. But nothing about the designer necessarily changed. Our relationship to their status changed. And there is a very old human impulse in that. We like discovering things. Discovering things gives us this tiny feeling of ownership and discernment. Once everybody else knows about it, some of that cultural value seems to disappear. The thing hasn't necessarily gotten worse. It's just stopped making us feel distinctive for liking it. And all of this is because we're human. We feel this way and we go through these kinds of feelings and motions because we are human, not because we're jealous or petty. But I do think it's really important and worth recognizing. Overexposed and overrated are not synonyms. You can be overexposed and excellent. You can be completely sick of hearing about something that absolutely deserves every bit of its attention and popularity. You can decide that you never want to see another petite knit sweater for the rest of your natural life without needing petite knit to be the problem. Maybe you've just had enough petite knit, and that's okay. Hide her, mute her, go find something weird and wonderful 12 pages deep that has 17 projects and photographs taken in someone's backyard in 2014. Seriously, actually, please do, and let me know what you find. That's a great subject for another Ravelry roulette video. But I think there's a difference between saying, I don't want to see this anymore, and saying, I'm blacklisting this designer. Because words do some work whether we intend them to or not. Hide, filter, I'd like to see something else, sounds like curation. Blacklisting carries a different vibe. It suggests exclusion due to something negative that they have done. And if that's what you mean, fine. You are absolutely allowed to mean it. But I also think choosing a loaded framing and then insisting that the framing means nothing is a hard sell. Because if the only problem is that you've personally seen enough of the designer, why does the response need to feel like a sanction? Why does somebody else's success need correction before you can enjoy knitting again? You don't need to make petite knit less popular in order to find somebody new. You don't need Andrea Mowry to disappear from Hot Right Now. You don't need a podcaster to knit differently so that your feed becomes more interesting to you. And you definitely don't need your algorithm to develop your taste for you. You can go find the thing that you want. That's the good news in all of this. You have more access to knitting patterns, designers, archives, books, magazines, projects, other knitters than almost any generation of knitters before you. So use it. Browse badly. Go too far into the search results. Follow a link to another link. Get weird. Get unusual. Get dark. Find something or somebody nobody handed to you and maybe should never have been handed to you in the first place because it's really putting you in a weird vibe, but that weird vibe is comforting because you need that difference and you need that nuance in your life. But don't tear down because you think that that's how you build up. Because if your feed keeps showing you the same thing and you're sick of it, maybe the first question doesn't need to be, who needs less attention? Maybe it's simply, where else am I willing to look? Your saturation point is yours. Your feed is yours. Your knitting is yours. And somebody else's success doesn't need to become a problem just because you're tired of seeing it. Sometimes you've just had enough. Close the tab, lace up your shoes, and go knit something else.